Are you a child of Abraham? If somebody asked you, are you a child of Abraham, what would you say? Yes? Okay. What does that mean? Do you know? Are you a child of Abraham? You say, I don't know. Or you say, I don't really care. That's a strange question. When was the last time somebody asked you if you were a child of Abraham? It's really a very important question. And you should care because according to the Bible, if you're not a child of Abraham, you don't have salvation. The Jews of Jesus' day, they understood this at least to some extent. They asserted, Abraham is our father. Jesus didn't agree. Now, of course, the Jews were descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel. The Israelites were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Israelites then became called Jews because they were associated with Jerusalem when the Babylonians came. So the name Jews and Israelites and Hebrews, they're kind of all interchangeable depending on the time of history. And so the Jews of Jesus' day, they were physical descendants of Abraham. But Jesus said, if you're children of Abraham, do the deeds of Abraham. In other words, if you don't do the deeds of Abraham, you're not a child of Abraham, even though they physically descended from him. Similarly, John the Baptist challenged those who were coming to him to be baptized regarding their standing as a child of Abraham. And so when he was baptizing, he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to him to be baptized. He said to them, he called them a bunch of snakes. He says, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Therefore bear fruit in keeping with repentance. And do you suppose that you can say to yourself, we have Abraham for our father? Don't think you can say and gain favor with God because you say, we have Abraham for our father. And John the Baptist said that if God wanted to, he could make these stones children of Abraham. In modern times, 50% of the world's population adhere to what's called Abrahamic religions. 50% of the world's population in some way adhere to a religion that points back to Abraham. And so, of course, we know that the Jews claim to be descendants of Abraham through Isaac. Rightly so. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Promises were given to Isaac, to Jacob, from which the Jews descended. And so Judaism finds its roots in Abraham. But so does Islam. Muslims claim to be descendants of Abraham through Ishmael. And then there's Christians who claim to be descendants of Abraham through faith in Jesus. Abraham is unique. God called him his friend. Sometimes Mary says, you're my best friend. And I say, you're my only friend. And we laugh. But to have God say, you're my friend. And God said of Abraham that he was a friend of God. And so we want to ask, what is it about Abraham that put him in that favored position? There's a verse in Genesis chapter 15. You can turn there, of course, if you like. And that's very prominent in the life of Abraham. And this is a verse that's quoted in the New Testament. It's quoted here in Romans chapter 4, and we'll look at that in a moment. But in Genesis chapter 15, verse 6, it says, Abraham believed in the Lord. And he, the Lord, reckoned it to him as righteousness. Abraham believed in the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. That verse is repeatedly quoted. It's quoted in the New Testament here in Romans chapter 4. It's quoted in the book of Galatians in Galatians chapter 3. It's quoted in the book of James in James chapter 2. It's alluded to in the book of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 11. And understanding how Abraham was saved is very important to us because the way Abraham was saved is exactly the way every person who is saved is saved. If you're not saved like Abraham was, you're not saved. How was that? Well, Abraham was saved by faith, right? He believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. But what is this faith and what kind of faith is it? And so today we want to peek at the faith of Abraham, the faith that produced salvation for Abraham. And we want to peek at it through the back door. That is, we want to ask the question and answer the question, what was Abraham's faith not? Many people have an idea of faith, and they claim to be saved, they claim to be followers of Jesus, and they latch on to something that Abraham's faith was not as a basis for their salvation. And so first of all, we find that we're not saved by personal righteousness. Personal righteousness. And so, as we think about the life of Abraham, as recorded in the book of Genesis, the end of Genesis chapter 11 introduces us to Abraham, and the record of his life goes through Genesis chapter 25. Obviously, we don't have time to look at all of that. Or we have time, but you won't give me enough time to look at all of those things. Nobody except Grant. Grant would give it. And so in Genesis chapter 12, we find Abraham called by God. And he went to the land of Canaan, took Sarah, his wife, Sarai as her name was. And they go to the land of Canaan, and he wanders around the land of Canaan for a number of years. And God gives him 7 promises. They're recorded in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. And Abraham had no children. God promised to give him the land, and he promised to give him children. Lots of them. But Sarah had no children. Abraham had no children. And then the time came where God says to Abraham, you will have a child of your own body. God clarified the promise, because Abraham thought that his servant would be his descendant, and God would make him a great nation through his servant. And then Sarah and Abraham worked together and introduced Hagar into the picture, and Ishmael was born. And later God says, no, it will be Sarah from your body and from Sarah. And then as a result of that, Isaac was born. So Abraham was 75 years old when he came to the land of Canaan. When he was 86 years old, Ishmael was born. 10 years is a long time. Then, when he was about 100 years old, Isaac was born. And then he died at 175 years. You can read it there in the book of Genesis. And so, God gave these promises to Abraham, and Abraham's life unfolds before us as God is fulfilling these promises. But what we see in Abraham's life is he was far from perfect. Abraham was of a family of idolaters. And throughout the Scriptures, it makes it clear that Abraham's descendants, his forefathers, including his father, worshipped idols. And so that was his heritage. Sometimes we think, well, I must be saved because my parents or my grandparents or, Well, Abraham wasn't saved because of the righteousness of his heritage. Matter of fact, for some reason, and the Bible doesn't explain why, God chose him. Out of all the people in the world, God chose him. God, and he can do that. And it doesn't tell us why. But God chose him and told him to go to a land. And Abraham was a liar. Right? He was a liar. He finds himself in somewhat of a tenuous situation, difficult situation. And he says, oh, this beautiful woman by my side, well, she's my sister. When she was his wife. Well, actually, his half-sister or something, right? But he lied, and he deceived people, and he received gifts. And he was an adulterer. He took Hagar to be his wife at Sarah's urging. It was consistent with the customs of the day. And of course, these things, the lying, bearing falsehood, and adultery, and those types. He didn't have the law. The law came later. But as we look at Abraham, he didn't have inherent righteousness that gained him favor with God. But Abraham was a friend of God. And we should not think that he gained that status because he was righteous. Romans 3 says there's none righteous, right? And the scriptures make that clear. Jeremiah says all of our righteousness, all of Israel's righteousness, all of our righteousness are like filthy rags. Nastiness. The best we have to offer God is go to the bottom of your trash can that's been sitting out behind your house for a long, long time and dig out that stuff on the bottom. That's the best you got to offer God. The best. The worst is worse. Right? And Titus 3:5 says, God saved us not on the basis of deeds which we have done in righteousness, but according to his mercy. And so here in Romans chapter 4, it's dealing with this whole issue of salvation. The book of Romans is about the righteousness of God and the necessity to have righteousness in order to be right with God. You can't be right with God unless you have perfect righteousness. I don't know about you, but that's a problem for me. Because I know there are deficiencies, huge deficiencies in my life. Past, present, and until the Lord comes, future. My righteousness is worse than Swiss cheese bad. Doesn't hold water. Here in Romans 8, it speaks about Abraham as the example of, Romans 4. It says, what shall we say about Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh has found? For if Abraham was justified, that word justified means made righteous. If Abraham was made righteous by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? And Abraham believed God, had faith in God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So faith is a noun, believe is a verb. Right? Believe God, faith in God, interchangeable. One is the status. I have faith in God, I am believing in God. One is active, one is the status. So Abraham had faith in God. That faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, verse 4, his wage is not reckoned as a favor, but what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is reckoned as righteousness. And so this righteousness is imparted and reckoned. And then it says in verse 6, just as David also speaks of the blessing, counting our blessings, speaks of the blessing upon the man to whom God reckons righteousness apart from the works of the law. And then he says this, quoting from Psalms, verse 7, blessed are those whose lawless deeds have been forgiven and whose sins have been covered. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account. And so the blessing here and the salvation that Abraham has is that God took away his sin, covered his sin, removed his sin. We have a tendency to look at other people, those people, some hypothetical people, as, well, those people are good people. But they're not. There's none good. Only God is good. And Abraham was not good. He was like me, like you. He was a sinner. And he believed God, and God counted his faith as righteousness. It wasn't his personal righteousness that resulted in his salvation. His salvation came because God, in his grace, blessed him, forgiving his sins, and his righteousness came by faith, believing in God. And so salvation, Abraham's salvation, and our salvation is not by personal righteousness. Also, salvation by faith alone excludes complete understanding or even complete knowledge. Go back to Genesis chapter 12. God says to Abraham, "Go forth from your country, move. Go forth from your relatives, leave behind your family. Go forth from your father's house, your inheritance, to a land I will show you." Right? So, one day Dave wakes up and says, "We're moving." Kathy says, "Where?" "I don't know, we're moving." Kathy says, "Where?" "I don't know, wherever God shows me." Kathy says, "Where?" Right? We want to know. Right, Kathy? You're not going to pack up until he tells you, are you? God said to Abraham, "Go to a land that I will show you." He didn't know. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going." We like to have all our ducks in a row, right? We want to know the next step, the next step, the next step, the next step. We want to see the end. Well, folks, faith doesn't necessarily have all of the ducks lined up in a row. Some of them are under the water. Some of them are flying high. You don't see them all. But God said, "Go, I'll give you a land. Go, I'll show you." And Abraham believed God. How do we know he believed God? Well, he went. Go down to Romans chapter 4, verse 18. So God says, "Go to a land I'll show you. I'll give you this land. I'll give your descendants this land." Abraham's like, I don't have any kids. It was a challenge. It was a struggle. Verse 18 of Romans chapter 4, it says, "In hope against hope he believed." There's no hope, but he had hope. There's no hope, but we have hope. You ever feel that way in your life? It's like, it's hopeless. And there is hope. It says, "In hope against hope he believed." Well, he had some very specific challenges. It says he believed in order that he might become the father of many nations. See, Abraham is the father not only of the Jews, but the father of all who follow in his steps of faith. According to that which was spoken, so shall your descendants be. So Abraham, there in Genesis 15, it tells us that Abraham's like, God had said, your reward will be great. And Abraham's like, well, God, I know what you promised, this paraphrase. I know what you promised me, but what are you going to give me? I don't have any children. Yeah, since I don't have any children, then this guy Eleazar of Damascus, my servant, he's like the head of my servants, and he will be my heir, and he will inherit everything. And God says, no. He says, you will have a descendant of your own body. And it says he took Abraham outside and said, look up at the stars. If you count them, that will be how many descendants. If you can count them. You're not going to be able to number them. There'll be so many. I don't even have one. Gotcha. How many stars are there? You ever tried to count stars? I mean, you go someplace, when Mary and I go hiking and go to some remote place, sometimes it's really dark there and the sky is really clear. And we look up, I can't look up, it's okay, we look up and it's like, there's so many stars. You can't even begin to count them. You know what? You ask a scientist, somebody who studies the stars, how many are there? And they're like, yeah, they can't count them. There's more, more and more. The best that we can do is guesstimate. But that's... And God told Abraham, look at these stars. No, there was no big cities around. If you go up my house and you look out at the stars, there's a big glow from Longview and Tulsa that's out there, and you can't see so many stars. On a clear night, sometimes you can see a lot, but usually the light. But Abraham's like there, and there wasn't street lights or anything. And all those stars. And this is what it says. And Abraham believed God. Now, when this happened, he was 86 years old. And when this happened, his wife had never had any children. And it says that he believed God. And it goes on here in Romans chapter 4, verse 19. And so, without becoming weak in faith, he contemplated his own body, now as good as dead. And I don't know how this is going to work. There's no hope. And he was about 100 years old, and he contemplated the deadness of Sarah's womb. And yet, with respect to the promise of God, he did not waver in unbelief, but grew strong in faith, giving the glory to God. You see, there's this little word there, grew. Our faith grows. You don't know everything. I don't know everything. But our faith grows. We learn more. And so when we think about salvation, you don't have to know everything. I know people who are hung up and don't come to salvation because they can't understand the Trinity. I've got to understand everything before I can believe. Well, it's impossible to understand everything. But God gives us enough information that we know and we can believe Him. And God grants to us righteousness. Actually, it's when you believe, then you can understand. Right? It takes away the blindness. And so Abraham did not know how this was going to work. He did not know how God was going to give him the land. He did not know how God was going to give him descendants. How He was going to make him a great nation. Faith in God does not require complete knowledge. It requires some knowledge. Right? Hebrews 11:6 says, without faith it's impossible to please God. For he who comes to God must believe, one, that He is, that God exists, and that He's the rewarder of those who seek Him. And so Abraham believed in the Lord. If you read carefully, it says Abraham believed in the Lord. Not just the promises of the Lord. The promises of the Lord give insight in the Lord, but it's believing in the Lord, who He is. Jesus revealed Himself to us as God's Son, and it's in faith in Jesus that's required for us to be saved. But you don't have to understand the Trinity. You don't have to understand how God can raise people from the dead. You don't understand have to understand how the resurrection will be. People who are afraid that God's not going to be able to figure out how to put them back together and give them a new body. God can handle that, okay? He created everything. He created you. If He needs to get certain molecules from someplace to put you back together, give you a new body, He can do that. Abraham believed God, but he didn't understand everything. He hoped against hope. And there's many things in our lives that we don't understand. But we don't have to understand those things. You don't have to understand what the mark of the beast is. You don't have to understand when Jesus will return to have faith in Him. Everyone is saved like Abraham was, by faith alone, in what God had revealed. So salvation excludes personal righteousness. It excludes complete knowledge. It also excludes rituals. You don't have to do rituals, follow rituals in order to be saved. Here in Romans chapter 4, it asks this question about the blessing of salvation that came to Abraham. Does it come only on a certain group of people? Only on those who practice the rite of circumcision? Or does it come upon all people? Or does it just come upon those who attend Bible churches? Or those who attend this type of church or that type of church? Or do this ritual or that ritual? Or who are baptized or who have communion? What does it say here? Verse 9. It says, is this blessing then upon the circumcised or the uncircumcised also? So circumcision was the sign of the covenant that God gave to Abraham. God made a covenant with him, and then God later gave him the sign of circumcision. For it says in verse 9, for we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it reckoned? While he was circumcised or uncircumcised? Not while he was circumcised, but while he was uncircumcised. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith, which he had while uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that the righteousness might be reckoned to them, and the father of circumcision to those who are not only of the circumcision, but also who follow in the steps of the faith of our father Abraham, which he had while he was uncircumcised. For the promise to Abraham or to his descendants that he would be heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. So if you look at the history of Abraham, Abraham was not circumcised until he was 99 years old. And the promise that he received righteousness was when he was 86 years old. So righteousness, the salvation that he received, was long before the sign of the covenant. It's not through our acts of righteousness or rituals that we go through that provide salvation. It's not through baptism or communion or whatever other ritual you may have or think. It is through faith, just like Abraham. And so Abraham is kind of what we would call the benchmark. He's the standard throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament for salvation. And how was he saved? Not by his own righteousness. Not by knowing everything. And not by following rituals. He was saved by faith. This month, I think October 5th actually is the 500th anniversary of when Martin Luther nailed what's called the 95 Thesis on the wall, or the door at the Church of Wittenberg. And what he said was, salvation is not through the church. Salvation is through the Word of God alone, through Christ alone, through faith alone, through grace alone. So if we look at Abraham as the example, it says he was saved by faith. Not by his works of righteousness, not by some religion. There was no church. Abraham was saved. There wasn't even a church. They didn't take an offering. They didn't have a communion cup. None of that stuff. But he was saved. Salvation by faith also excludes the law, or keeping the law to be righteous. How many laws did Abraham have to obey? What laws did God give Abraham? Don't eat crabs. Don't eat pigs, buzzards. Did God give Abraham those laws? No. So if you look at the history of God's relationship with people, God gave Adam and Eve one law. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They ate. And then after that, what was the law? Don't eat from that tree? Well, no, because that tree was gone. God protected it, right? And then it was gone in the flood. And so from the time they left the garden, they didn't have God's express law given to them. They all died because of Adam's sin. And they sinned. But the law of God, they knew God and they still sinned. So much so that God flooded the whole earth, destroyed the whole earth. But there was no specific law that those people were violating that was expressed. It wasn't until 430 years after Abraham that the law was given to Israel. There are people today that think you have to keep the law in the Old Testament in order to be saved. You don't. How do I know this? Well, Abraham was saved. He didn't keep the law. He didn't even have the law. Right? Say right. Right. Abraham didn't have the law. And that's what he's saying here. It's not through the law. Verse 13. The promise to Abraham, or to his descendants, that he would be the heir of the world was not through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if those who are of the law are heirs, faith is made void and the promise is nullified. If salvation is through the law, God is not faithful. That's what he's saying. For the law brings about wrath, where there is no law, neither is there violation. For this reason, it is by faith, that it may be in accordance with grace, in order that the promise may be, notice this, may be certain. May be certain to all the descendants of Abraham. Not only to those who are of the law, but to those who are of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. If we had time, we could go to Romans chapter 9, 10, and 11 and look at the discussion about the nation Israel and the discussion about faith and God's sovereignty and God's choice and all of those types of things. But the point is that without faith, there is no salvation. So, personally, I don't think the Arabs are descendants of Ishmael. I studied this. I don't think they are. But even if they are, if they don't have the faith of Abraham, they're not children of Abraham. The Jews are not, if they don't have the faith of Abraham, they're not children of Abraham, as they don't receive the blessings of Abraham unless they have faith. And the same way for you and me. We are Gentiles. We are outside of the physical descendants of Abraham, but we receive the blessings of Abraham through the faith of Abraham. And I'm sure it sounds kind of narrow-minded to say that all people who claim to be descendants of Abraham, it's only those who believe, like Abraham believed, that are truly children of Abraham. And so we're not saved by conformity to laws or keeping a law. We're saved by faith. Like Abraham was saved by faith. Now, the content of Abraham's faith and the object of Abraham's faith was God. But what we know about God today, because of the Scriptures, is more than Abraham knew. Somebody say, well, Abraham had to believe in Jesus in order to be saved. Abraham believed in God and what God had revealed to him at that time. God had not revealed himself in human flesh at that time. On the other hand, apart from the sacrifice of Jesus, there would be no righteousness. If Jesus hadn't died, no person would ever be saved, because there would be no well of righteousness to draw from. So when it says that Abraham believed God, he had faith in God, and it was imputed to him as righteousness, the righteousness that he received was the righteousness of Jesus. Because apart from Jesus, there is no salvation. But Abraham, perhaps, I don't know, maybe he did know all these things, but the Scriptures don't tell us he knew these things. But the reality is that he is saved as a gift of God by faith, by the atoning work, the substitutionary work of Jesus. And every person who's ever been saved will be saved because of Jesus dying for their sins. They will be saved only if they are perfectly righteous, and they will only be perfectly righteous if they are given the righteousness of Jesus, and they are only given the righteousness of Jesus by faith as a gift. And so Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. We believe God, and it is reckoned to us. It is given to us. It is imputed to us as righteousness, not by our own good works, not by keeping the law, not by rituals, but by faith. By faith alone. If we're honest with ourselves, our efforts to keep the law fail. Right? I was talking with somebody recently, and we were talking about how there are people who seem to walk really close to the Lord, and there's people who seem to walk really far from the Lord, kind of on the ragged edge, like, and there's other people who just seem, they're really spiritual people, and I said, hey, those people who seem to be really spiritual, they're probably really not. They just appear to be spiritual. I'll always have a wet paper bag to hold our own righteousness. And the cow put it there. Finally, we're not saved by words alone. Faith is not knowledge alone. Faith is not the expressing of that knowledge. Faith is not saying that we believe what we know. Faith is living according to the truth. God said, Abraham, go to a land I'll show you. What did Abraham do? He went. He obeyed God and he went. God says, you're going to have a descendant of your own body. What did he do? Well, I think this is what happened. I might be wrong. I think he went home and told Sarah, hey, Sarah, listen, God told me Eleazar is not going to be, I'm so excited. Eleazar is not going to be my heir. I'm going to have a descendant of my own body. And she's like, oh, really? Here, okay, I know how we can make this work. Here's Hagar. She can have a child. I'll adopt the child. It will be a descendant of your own body, just as God. We're going to help God out here. I believe Hagar, that situation with Hagar was an act of faith by Abraham and Sarah, but it was misplaced faith. God says this is going to work. Later, God says, no. And Abraham even then says, oh, God, let Ishmael live before you. I don't need another son. God says, no. It will be Sarah. Right? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. See, that believing God and reckoned to righteousness was before Ishmael, wasn't it? God told him that it won't be through Ishmael that the promises will come, it will be through Isaac. And then God says to Abraham, take your son. Your only son. Your son through whom all the promises, God didn't express all this, but He expressed it before. Your son through whom you will be a great nation and through whom I will give this land. And take that son and take him to a place I will show you and kill him. Now, that just seems so bizarre to us. But it wasn't so bizarre to Abraham because it was part of their culture and how they did things. In their idolatry, they often sacrificed their children to the gods. And it just seems abhorrent to us. But that's not the point. The point is, on the other side of Isaac were the fulfillment of the promises of God through Isaac. God could not fulfill His promises without Isaac. And so, Abraham's like, I don't know how this is going to work. How are you going to fulfill the promises to make a great nation of me through Isaac if Isaac is dead? The book of Hebrews gives us a little glimpse into Abraham's thinking. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 17, it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, it was a test for Abraham, a test of his faith. You know, God sometimes tests our faith. Right? Consider it all joy when you encounter, or James 1, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials or testing, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect result, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If anyone lacks, let him ask of God. If he lacks wisdom, let him ask, how do I respond to this? Let him ask of God. And He'll give him wisdom. Well, it says of Abraham, he was tested. When he offered up Isaac, he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants will be called. And then it says this in verse 19 of Hebrews 11. Abraham considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which He also received him back as a type. So somewhere in Abraham's thinking was, well, Isaac's got to live, and even if I kill him, God's going to make him alive again. God is able to do that. He believed God. And so his willingness to offer his son was that he had faith in God, that God would... Wow. You see, the promises of God. He believed God. The other text in James chapter 2, it speaks about Abraham as an example of faith. And James chapter 2 is one of those texts that should be in the forefront of our mind in our culture and society today. Somebody asked me just yesterday, said, how is it that so many people don't believe there's any such thing as sin anymore? How is it that people think they have faith in God, but there's no such thing as sin? Well, it's because their faith in God is only in their head, not based upon the truth of God's Word. And so in James chapter 2, it talks about faith. It says, what use is it, verse 14, James chapter 2, verse 14, what use is it, my brethren, if a man says he has faith, but he has no works, can that faith save him? And then he gives an illustration. If a brother or sister is without clothing in need of daily food, and one of you says, go in peace, be warmed and be filled, and yet do not give them what is necessary, what use is that? And this is not about giving. This is not a verse about giving. This is a verse about faith. What use is it if you say you have faith and you don't act on it? That's the same as saying, oh, you're cold and hungry, be warm, be filled, and don't do anything. The same is true about faith. Verse 17, even so faith, if it has no works, is dead, being by itself. But someone will say, you have faith, I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. You believe God is one. You do well. The demons also believe in... You're in good company with the demons. They shudder, though. Verse 20, but are you willing to recognize, you moron, that's the word there, you foolish fellow, are you willing to recognize that faith without works is useless? And he uses Abraham in another example here. He says, was not our father Abraham justified by works, made righteous by works, when he offered up Isaac on the altar? So, chronology. Abraham believed God, it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Ishmael was born, maybe a year later or so. 13 years, 14 years later, Isaac was born. Some years later, Isaac was old enough to walk and carry wood for a long ways. God offered him up. Abraham believed God, it was reckoned to him as righteousness. 20 years later, Abraham's faith was perfected, completed, in the demonstration that his faith was genuine and real by his actions. It wasn't offering up Isaac that saved him. It demonstrated that his faith was real. He truly believed God. And we say we believe God, but then we blatantly ignore the things that God says are right or wrong. Is our faith real or not? Our faith is like the faith of Abraham. Not based on rituals, not based on works, not based on the law, not based on our own righteousness, but a faith that loves God, that believes God, and acts in obedience to God because we believe. It's not the act of obedience that results in the salvation, it's the salvation that results in the act of obedience. And so it's clear that if any person is saved, we're saved just like Abraham was. You've been saved because of your faith, like Abraham's faith. Abraham's faith was in the Lord. Our faith is in the Lord. We're saved not by works, or not by words, or not by rituals, not by keeping law, not by our own righteousness. You see, the Lord reckons to us righteousness. It is the righteousness of Jesus that God takes, and when we put our faith in Jesus, God gives us that righteousness, and we stand in that righteousness. It's a gift of God, not based on anything we have done, or haven't done, or will do, or won't do, because Jesus' righteousness is complete. And when we have that righteousness, then we are set free from sin and death, and are free to love one another as God has called us to. And that's why it says those who have faith in God love God and love one another, because we've been set free from sin and death. So our salvation, like Abraham's, is by God's grace. You can't boast in that. I can't boast in that. We can't glory in that. We can only give to God the glory that He alone deserves. Because He saves us as a gift by faith, just like He saved Abraham and everyone else.